Hello YouTube, I'm Marco, or your local watch cardinal. I would like to discuss what I feel is a pretty relevant topic given my last few videos, which is why I ultimately, as a watch enthusiast, and a young watch enthusiast at that, a young collector as well, love and hate Rolex. Now of course to me, Rolex is one of the best, if not the best watch brands in the world, not so much for their kind of finishing or their value retention, but more so for the reasons that I'll dive into more in the video. Of course, before we begin, customary whiz watch check. I'm wearing my Panerai PAM 183. Love this watch. So, why do I love Rolex? Well, for me, Rolex produces watches that are engineered first and foremost just beautifully. The materials that they use, again, the 904L steel, as I mentioned in my first video I ever published on this channel, is the best in the watch industry, right? It's the highest quality material. It's the most wear resistant, the most scratch resistant. And of course, in terms of their case designs and their actual bracelets, I think they have the best in the industry. Now, I prefer watches on kind of leather straps because I find that a lot of metal bracelets are really poorly done. They're pretty cumbersome. They pull my hair. Also, they don't taper very well. Now, I have none of these problems when I've actually worn a Rolex. I've worn an Explorer 1 before, and to me it was just engineered beautifully. I mean, from the bracelet to the clasp, the bracelet tapered really well, the clasp was really nice, you could adjust it on the fly, and so Rolex to me, in terms of engineering, obviously it's known as kind of the Mercedes-Benz of the watch industry, in that their watches are beautifully engineered, and I tend to agree with that. I think that what they produce is just a cut above what everyone else produces at their price point. Now, of course, can they compete with JLC or Patek or Lange or some of these kind of more independent brands like Voutilainen in terms of their finishing and kind of the quality or the grade of their materials in terms of precious metals and all that stuff? No, of course not. That's not the argument that I'm making or will ever make, right? Those watches are, in terms of their horology, in terms of their kind of horological makeup, far more significant than anything Rolex makes. And it's just by virtue of the fact that their finishing is better, their use of materials is slightly higher because they're using precious metal as opposed to steel. And so for that reason, Rolex isn't the king in terms of hot horology. Or at the accessible level of luxury in the watch industry, I think that Rolex really dominates that market as a result of their supreme engineering. Now, of course, I have to mention as well the fact that Rolex, to me, makes some of, if not the most accurate watches in the world. And I have to applaud them for that, right? Their watches are only getting more accurate as better technologies come out. Their power reserves are lengthening, right? They just released the new Submariner with that increased power reserve of 70 hours now. And so in terms of their watches, I think they're really well suited, kind of more so for the everyday kind of gentleman, right? I think they're just great watches. They're engineered fantastically. And of course, they're extremely accurate. Now, of course, as well, I have to mention the other reason why I really like Rolex watches, which is their timeless design, right? In terms of their watches, as I mentioned, pretty much every single watch, apart from their Cellini and their Skydweller, which I believe the Skydweller is an icon in the making, is an iconic kind of watch movement, right? From the Submariner to the Daytona, to the Milgauss, to the Datejust, and so on. You go down the line, pretty much everything apart from the Cellini is a design icon. And you can't say that about any other watch brand. Sir, Patek has the Calatrava and their, kind of high horology complications, or annual calendars, perpetual calendar chronographs, which they invented. And granted, those are pretty iconic in their own right. But to me, the designs have changed over the years, right? The cases have gotten bigger, they've changed the layouts of the dial, they've changed the use of their material. And so what you see in Rolex is kind of a transition from the old to the new that is pretty smooth, whereas you see rapid change from, for example, a Patek from the 70s to a Patek today. And so that's something I definitely have to commend Rolex, is that their designs are iconic, they're timeless, and they're things that I feel will never age, but will rather gracefully age. They'll gracefully age. But of course, with every good thing, there are always its negatives. And with Rolex, respectively, I think that there are a lot of cons that make me question whether or not I should get into Rolex as a young and aspiring watch collector and watch enthusiast. The first one being is that their watches are impossible to get. I mean, Jesus Christ, you cannot get a Rolex steel sports watch at retail. I mean, even if you ask to be put on a wait list for an Oyster Perpetual, which is their entry-level model, it's like you're pulling teeth. I went to a Rolex authorized dealer once, and listen, I'm a young guy. I'm not probably the typical clientele that they see at those authorized dealers. I didn't even get looked at for half an hour. I was in the store. I mean, it was bloody ridiculous. I couldn't even get a salesman to even talk to me about selling me a Rolex. They were taking me to the Jaeger and the IWC, which I don't want those watches. I want Rolex. I want steel sports Rolex. And so that's one thing that kind of cheeses me off, makes me not want to collect the brand. And I think it's actually a really big negative for Rolex, especially for new collectors. And I think it will affect them down the line. Another reason I'm kind of against Rolex is because they're collectors. Now, not all collectors of Rolex are kind of fall within this genre, but I feel a lot of collectors only care about the investment potential, the value retention of Rolex watches, as opposed to the reasons I mentioned earlier, right? The engineering, the timelessness of their designs, the incredibly accurate movements. They care about the fact that they're exclusive watches that they can show off to their friends and say, hey, look, I have this hard to get Rolex that will only increase in value over time. And I think that, to me, again, turns me off, because it's not a good look on a brand when your kind of collectors are only care about the investment potential of your watches as opposed to the artistry with which the watch is manufactured, right? And so for me, again, I think it's actually going to hurt Rolex in the long run, which is a topic I will get into in a little bit. And the last point I'd like to make is the, of course, horrible authorized dealer experience. As I mentioned, I went to a Rolex AD. I was there about half an hour wearing my Panerai. I'm a young collector, right? So you would think, you know, build a relationship with that guy. Maybe he'll turn out to be a prosperous client in the future. No. I didn't even get looked at the authorized dealer. I mean, it was horrible. It was an awful experience. I remember leaving there feeling sick to my stomach, feeling like less than what I was. And, you know, I didn't get to even kind of talk to a sales representative about the Rolex that I wanted, which was ultimately the Explorer 1. The only watch from Rolex that I like is really an Explorer 1, just because the brand kind of cheeses me off. There's so many things about the brand that are incredible, but there's also so many things about the brand that turn me off, because, you know, you get these horrible collectors that are really watch investors, and you get these horrible collectors who go into an authorized dealer, spend a boatload of money, get their way into these incredible watches, and then really don't even appreciate them for what they are, and just appreciate their exclusivity, the scarcity, and of course the investment potential of these watches. And I think that's actually going to affect Rolex in the long term, because what you're going to see is people increasingly move away from Rolex, right? Lest we forget that 20 years ago, in the early to mid to late 90s and beginning of the 2000s, Rolex was not always a top dog, right? You would go for Panerai, you would go for JLC, you would go for IWC. Those were really kind of the hot models, which today have kind of taken a back seat in today's market, right? People are looking more so for sports watches, and I think Rolex kind of dominates the sports watch world. And so I think what you're going to see as a result of kind of this snobby authorized dealer experience is more people moving away from Rolex and getting into brands like, as I mentioned, kind of the 50 best watches under 5,000, right? Omega, IWC, Breitling. I think we're going to see a resurgence of these brands, because you just can't get steel sports Rolex at retail. And so people are kind of going to get cheesed off, I feel, in the same way that I am, and just turn to these other brands like Panerai, for example, to fulfill that need for a great everyday luxury wristwatch. And so I'm interested to see what Rolex will be like in about 10 to 15 years, if their strategy will continue, if of course their preferred client or VIP client system will stand the test of time. Personally, I don't think so. I don't think they could keep this strategy up and actually retain the client base that they have at the moment. So to conclude, there's a number of things that I love about Rolex, right? As I mentioned, the timeless design, the incredible engineering, and of course, the just magnificent timekeeping that these watches have, right? In terms of the movements, as Roger Smith said, they're bulletproof. In terms of the design of their cases, of their dials, and the manufacturing of their parts and components, they're bulletproof. So nobody, in my opinion, can really compete with Rolex at that price point on their level with respect to how they engineer and manufacture their watches. But at the same time, there's a lot of things about the brand, kind of this exclusivity, this scarcity, this investment component of their watches that kind of cheeses me off of it. And I think it will affect Rolex in the long run if they continue to operate with this kind of modus operandi where they're just turning away new clients. They're saying, well, if you don't spend X amount per month or X amount per year at our authorized dealers and buy all this jewelry and these watches you don't want, well, you can't get the watches that you ultimately are looking for, right? Let's say a Submariner, an Explorer 1, forget the Pepsi, forget the Daytona, right? Even the entry-level models. Maybe you just want a blue dial Datejust. Even those are impossible to get at retail now. So I think it'll be interesting to see where Rolex is headed in the next, let's say 5 to 10 years. Will it be at the same spot it will be at in 20 years from now, in 10 years from now? It's difficult to say, right? Rolex has been riding kind of this mass hysteria wave, I would say, since the Paul Newman auction, right? Since the Paul Newman auction, they gain a lot of traction, they gain a lot of hype, a lot of momentum, and you see now Rolex as kind of the watch brand, right? It's the watch brand that everybody grows up knowing, it's the watch brand that everybody aspires to collect, and as a result of not being able to get their watches at retail, I think what you're going to see is increasingly more collectors kind of get away from Rolex, and what you might see is, in the long run, of course, I'm not talking in the next 1 to 5 years, right? I'm talking probably in the 10 years and beyond, Rolex kind of lose its spot as that top dog of the watch industry. Now, I know that Terry Stern, who's the head of Patek Philippe, said that he admires above anybody else in the watch industry Rolex, and of course that is for their retail kind of strategy and their retail success, and I understand that, but at the same time, I think that their strategy is actually very short-sighted. I think it's one that will hurt Rolex in the long run and will ultimately turn away collectors like myself and potentially collectors like you guys watching this video to other brands like Omega, like Breitling, like IWC, like Panerai, like JLC, and all those amazing affordable luxury brands that compete with Rolex that are honestly similarly well made in terms of their components and their movements. And so I think it'll be an interesting topic to discuss again kind of 10 years from now and see if I was right in the end, right? Is their strategy going to hold the test of time, right? This kind of preferred client, VIP client system? I don't think so. I think it's going to turn away a lot of people, and I think if they continue to operate under this kind of strategy, what you'll get is Rolex losing its spot as the top kind of watch brand in the watch world. I think maybe people will turn to hot horology. I think that's unlikely though. I think people will just ultimately turn to these other brands that they can get pretty easily at retail, or they can buy at a huge discount on the gray market. But I'll leave it at that. I'd love to know what you guys think. Please let me know down in the comment section what you think of the Rolex system, retail system at the moment, and if you think it will affect and hurt their brand in the long run. I would love to get your opinions. And of course, this is an invitation to like the video, to subscribe for more in the future. And this is your local watch cardinal signing out. I'll see you guys in the next one.